On this day in 1952, the Big Bang Theory is proposed in the Physical Review. In 1976, Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs found Apple Computer in the garage of Jobs' parents' house. In 2001, the Netherlands became the first country in the world to make same-sex marriage legal. And finally, in 2004, Google introduces Gmail. But did you know? On this day in 1917, US President Woodrow Wilson asked Congress to declare war against Germany. In 1902, Electric Theater, the first full-time movie theater in the United States, opens in LA. And finally, in 1513, explorer Juan Ponce de Leon claims Florida for Spain as the first known European to reach Florida. But did you know? On this day in 1868, Hawaiian surfs the highest wave ever, a 50-foot tidal wave. In 1882, American outlaw Jesse James is shot in the back of the head and killed by fellow gang member Robert Ford. In 1973, the first mobile phone call is made in downtown Manhattan by Motorola employee Martin Cooper to Bell's lab headquarters in New Jersey. And finally, in 1922, Joseph Stalin is appointed General Secretary of the Russian Communist Party by ailing Vladimir Lenin. But did you know? On this day in 2013, a giant tarantula with a 20-centimeter leg span is discovered in Sri Lanka. In 1975, Microsoft is founded as a partnership between Bill Gates and Paul Allen. In 1973, the World Trade Center, then the world's tallest building, opens in New York City. And finally, in 1968, U.S. civil rights activist Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated by James Earl Ray at the Lorraine Hotel in Memphis, Tennessee. But did you know? On this day in 1923, Firestone Tire and Rubber Company starts producing inflatable tires. In 1847, Birkenhead Park, the first civic public park, opens in Birkenhead, England, designed by Joseph Paxton. And finally, in 1722, Dutch navigator Jacob Roggeveen is the first European to discover Easter Island. But did you know? On this day in 1772, Catherine the Great, Empress of Russia, ends tax on men with beards, enacted by Tsar Peter the Great in 1698. In 2016, the first baby is born with DNA from 3 parents in Mexico. In 1896, the first modern-day Summer Olympic Games opens in Athens, Greece. And finally, in 1917, the US declares war on Germany and enters World War I. But did you know? On this day in 2016, the longest ever captured python is found in Malaysia, 26 feet or 8 meters. In 1948, the World Health Organization is formed by the United Nations. And finally, in 1954, US President Dwight D. Eisenhower, in a news conference, is the first to voice fear and the domino effect of communism in Indochina. But did you know? On this day in 1766, the first fire escape is patented, which was a wicker basket on a pulley and chain. In 1974, Hank Aaron hits his 715th home run, breaking Babe Ruth's record in Atlanta. And finally, in 2021, Egyptian archaeologists announced their most important find since Tutankhamun's tomb, a discovery of a lost golden city, 3,000-year-old ancient city of Aten near Luxor. But did you know? On this day in 1865, Confederate General Robert E. Lee and his 26,000 troops surrender at Appomattox Courthouse to General Grant, ending the Civil War in North Virginia. In 2003, Baghdad falls to U.S. forces, ending the invasion of Iraq, but resulting in widespread looting. In 1768, John Hancock refuses to allow 2 British customs agents to go below deck of his ship, considered by some to be the first act of physical resistance to British authority in the colonies. In 1869, Hudson Bay Company seizes territory to Canada. And finally, in 1667, the first public art exposition happens in Paris. But did you know? On this day in 1912, the RMS Titanic set sail for Southampton for her maiden and final voyage. In 1970, Paul McCartney officially announces the split of the Beatles. In 1972, the US, USSR, and 70 other nations agree to ban biological weapons. And finally, in 1996, the fastest wind speed ever recorded, not a tornado, 253 miles per hour, happens during Tropical Cyclone Olivia on Barrow Island, Australia. But did you know? On this date in 2013, fossilized dinosaur eggs with embryos are discovered in China. In 1968, U.S. President Lyndon B. Johnson signs the 1968 Civil Rights Act. In 2015, Barack Obama and Raul Castro meet in Panama, the first meeting of a U.S. and Cuban heads of state since the Cuban Revolution. And finally, in 1814, Napoleon Bonaparte abdicates unconditionally and is exiled to the island of Elba in the Mediterranean. But did you know? On this day in 1961, Russian cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin becomes the first person to orbit Earth. In 1872, Jesse James' gang robs a bank of $1,500 in Columbia, Kentucky. 1 person died. In 1811, the first U.S. colonists on Pacific coast arrive in Cape Disappointment, Washington. And finally, in 1937, Sir Frank Whittle ground tests the first jet engine designed to power an aircraft at Rugby, England. But did you know? On this day in 1970, Apollo 13 announces, "Okay, Houston, we have a problem here," as the Beech-built oxygen tank explodes en route to the moon. In 1860, the first Pony Express reaches Sacramento, California. And finally, in 1964, New Zealander Colin Bosher shears a record 565 sheep in one workday. But did you know? On this day in 1912, the RMS Titanic, the world's largest ocean liner, hits an iceberg at 11:40 p.m. off Newfoundland, sinks in early hours of April 15th. In 1865, U.S. President Abraham Lincoln is shot in the head by John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater in Washington. He dies a day later. In 2015, archaeologists announced they have found in Kenya 3.3 million-year-old stone tools, the oldest ever discovered and which predate the earliest humans. And finally, in 2003, the Human Genome Project is completed with 99% of the human genome sequenced at the accuracy of 99.99%. But did you know? On this day in 1955, Ray Kroc opens the first McDonald's Inc. fast food restaurant in Des Plaines, Illinois. In 1947, Jackie Robinson becomes the first African American to play U.S. Major League Baseball. And finally, in 1861, the Federal Army of 75,000 volunteers mobilized by U.S. President Abraham Lincoln for the Civil War. But did you know? On this day in 1943, Swiss scientist Dr. Albert Hofmann discovers the psychedelic effects of LSD. In 1929, the New York Yankees became the first MLB team to permanently feature numbers on backs of uniforms. Numbers corresponded with the position and batting order. In 2017, a world record gathering of 662 Charlie Chaplin lookalikes happened in Sweden on the late Chaplin's birthday. And finally, in 1917, Vladimir Lenin issues his radical April thesis, calling for Soviets to take power during the Russian Revolution. But did you know? On this day in 2011, Game of Thrones, based on fantasy novels George R.R. Martin, premieres on HBO. In 2012, the 8th century St. Cuthbert Gospel, Europe's oldest intact book, is purchased by the British Library for £9 million. In 1961, 1,400 Cuban exiles land in the Bay of Pigs in a doomed attempt to overthrow Fidel Castro. In 1492, Christopher Columbus signs a contract with Spanish monarchs to find the Indies, which was stated a goal of converting people to Catholicism. This promises him 10% of all riches found and governorship of any lands encountered. And finally, in 1982, the Canadian Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau and the Queen Elizabeth II signed the Proclamation of Constitutional Act, establishes a Charter of Rights and Freedoms as part of the country's new constitution. But did you know? On this day in 1775, Paul Revere and William Dawes ride from Charleston to Lexington warning the regulars are coming. In 1924, the first crossword puzzle book is published by Simon & Schuster. In 1934, the first laundromat opens in Fort Worth, Texas. And finally, in 1783, George Washington issues General Order announcing the end of hostilities with Britain, giving thanks to Almighty and offering congratulations and authorizing an extra ration of alcohol to the troops to celebrate. But did you know? On this date in 1775, American Revolution begins in Lexington, Massachusetts. The shot heard around the world takes place later that day in Concord. In 1770, British explorer Captain James Cook first sights Australia, writes in his logbook that what we have as yet seen of this land appears rather low and not very hilly, the face of the country green and woody, but the seashore is all white sand. And finally, in 2011, Fidel Castro resigns his position as the first secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Cuba after 45 years of holding the title. But did you know? On this day in 1611, first known performance of Shakespeare's tragedy Macbeth at the Globe Theatre in London, recorded by Simon Foreman. In 1999, the Columbine High School massacre happens, 13 people killed and 24 injured. And finally, in 1979, U.S. President Jimmy Carter is attacked by a swamp rat which swam up to his fishing boat in Georgia. But did you know? On this day in 1918, World War I German fighter, the Red Baron, shot down and killed in France. Canadian pilot Arthur Roy Brown credited with the kill. Catherine the Great and Queen Elizabeth II both had birthdays today. And finally, in 1959, Alf Dean uses a rod and reel hooks a 2,664-pound, 16-foot, 10-inch great white shark off the coast of Australia. But did you know? On this day in 1981, more than $3.3 million is stolen from the First National Bank of Arizona in the then largest U.S. bank robbery in history. In 2016, the Paris Agreement on Climate Change is signed in New York. And finally, in 1500, Pedro Cabal is the first European to discover Brazil. But did you know? On this day in 2016, Beyoncé releases her sixth album, Lemonade, with a 1-hour film on HBO. In 1861, Robert E. Lee is named the commander of Virginia Confederate Forces. John Cena has a birthday today. And finally, in 1989, Wine merchant William Sokolin breaks a bottle of 1787 Chateau Margaux, possibly belonging to Thomas Jefferson, worth $500,000 at the Four Seasons restaurant in New York. But did you know? On this day in 1184, the Greeks entered Troy using the Trojan horse. In 1898, Spain declares war after rejecting U.S. ultimatum to withdraw from Cuba. In 1916, the Easter Rising of Irish Republicans against British occupation begins in Dublin. And finally, in 1887, Russia declares war on the Ottoman Empire. But did you know? On this day in 1507, German cartographer Martin Waldseemüller is the first to use the name America on the world map. In 1960, the first submerged circumnavigation of the Earth is completed by the U.S. submarine Triton in 60 days, 21 hours. In 1990, the Hubble Space Telescope is placed in orbit by Space Shuttle Discovery. 1792, the guillotine is first used in France, executing highwayman Nicolas Pelletier. And finally, in 1660, English Convention Parliament meets and votes to restore Charles II. But did you know? On this date in 1986, the world's worst nuclear disaster happens in Chernobyl. In 1859, Dan Sickles is acquitted of murder on grounds of temporary insanity, the first time this defense is used successfully in the US. And finally, in 1941, a tradition of an organ player at a baseball stadium begins. But did you know? On this day in 1965, R.C. Duncan patents Pampers disposable diapers. In 1565, the first Spanish settlement in the Philippines forms in Cebu City. And finally, in 1865, steamboat SS Sultana explodes in the Mississippi River, killing up to 1,800 people and the 2,427 passengers in the greatest maritime disaster in the United States history. Most were paroled Union POWs on their way home. But did you know? On this date in 1902, using the Gregorian calendar, the 1 billionth minute since the start of January 1st, year 0 occurs at 10:40 a.m. In 1937, the first commercial flight across the Pacific operated by Pan Am happens. And finally, in 2004, Shrek the Sheep from New Zealand is finally shown live on TV after 6 years of avoidance. The fleece weighs 60 pounds. But did you know? On this day in 1953, the first U.S. experimentation 3D TV broadcast showed an episode of Space Patrol. In 1945, the U.S. Army liberates 31,601 people from Dachau, a Nazi concentration camp in Germany. And finally, in 1990, wrecking cranes began tearing down the Berlin Wall. But did you know? On this day in 1789, George Washington is inaugurated as the first president of the United States of America. In 1952, Mr. Potato Head is the first toy advertised on television. In 1989, the World Wide Web, WWW, is first launched in public domain. And finally, in 1945, Adolf Hitler dies in a bunker, leading to the end of his German rule. But did you know?